He is likely one of the few human beings whose personal ambition actually altered the genetic makeup of the planet. He did not begin as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He began as Temujin, a thin, insignificant boy born into a world of raw courage and unbridled ambition. Before he was a king of kings, he was a sullen, withdrawn outcast whose own tribe had written him off as a no-hoper. In this week's biography, we trace the ascension, the conquests, and the macabre legacy of the man who conquered almost everything, Temujin, the Genghis Khan. The world Temujin entered did not feel like a beginning. It felt like the aftermath of something already broken. In the middle of the 12th century, the Mongolian plateau was not ruled, it was contested. Old powers had collapsed, leaving no single authority strong enough to impose order, and no memory of peace strong enough to restrain violence. The great nomadic empires that once dominated the steppe had faded into legend, and what remained was a vacuum, wide, cold, and unforgiving. Across this open land, 5 major tribal confederations circled one another like predators. The Karaits held the central grasslands, the Naimans controlled the western routes, the Merkits roamed the northern forests, the Tatars pressed from the east, and the Mongols, Temujin's people, had sunk to their lowest point, politically weak, fragmented, and routinely dominated by others. This was not a stable balance. It was a constant state of near war. Alliances shifted without warning. Loyalty lasted only as long as advantage. Raids for livestock were routine. Women were abducted. Blood feuds passed from father to son. Survival depended less on honor than on speed, deception, and memory. On the steppe, forgetting an insult could be fatal. Remembering one could define a lifetime. Watching all of this from the south was the Jin dynasty of northern China. They did not try to conquer the steppe outright. Instead, they perfected a quieter strategy: division. The Jin paid one tribe to attack another. They rewarded today's ally and punished tomorrow's threat. Their goal was simple: to make sure no single leader ever rose strong enough to unite the grasslands and turn northward chaos into a southern invasion. For decades, it worked. Into this fractured world, around the year 1162, a boy was born who would later be known as Genghis Khan. At birth, he was called Temujin. Even his origins blurred the line between history and myth. Mongol tradition traced his lineage back to a blue-gray wolf and a fallow doe, Borte Chino and Koai Maral, figures said to have crossed a great body of water and settled beneath the shadow of sacred mountains. Whether the crossing was a sea or Lake Baikal hardly mattered. What mattered was meaning. The story anchored Mongol identity to a landscape: the Henti Mountains, the Onan River, Burkhan Haldon. These were not just places, they were sanctified ground. From this mythic union descended Bodenchar Moncog, the founder of the Borjigin clan. Generations passed, names accumulated, power rose and fell, and 11 generations later, the lineage produced Yasugei. Yasugei was not a king, he was not even a major ruler. He was a minor chieftain of the Kiayad sub-tribe, respected enough to lead, not strong enough to dominate. His authority depended on alliances, reputation, and the fragile consent of others who could withdraw their loyalty at any moment. It was into this precarious position that Temujin was born. Legend says the child emerged clutching a blood clot in his fist, the size of a knucklebone. Among steppe peoples, this was an omen, a sign of a life marked by bloodshed. Whether anyone truly saw it is impossible to know. What matters is that the story survived because it matched what came next. Temujin was named after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently captured. On the steppe, names carried power. To give a child the name of a defeated enemy was to symbolically claim that enemy's strength. It was a ritual of appropriation, not mercy. Temujin's childhood did not last long. When he was still young, Yasugi stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars while traveling. Steppe law demanded hospitality, even among enemies. Yasugi accepted the food. The Tatars remembered old grievances. They poisoned it. Yasugi made it back to his camp before the poison killed him, but his authority died faster than his body. With their protector gone, Temujin's family discovered how quickly status evaporated on the steppe. The Taichiod clan, rivals within the Mongol Confederation, moved decisively. They stripped Yasugi's widow, Hoyalin, and her 7 children of their livestock. They withdrew protection. Then they left. Not in exile, in abandonment. They left the family alone on the grasslands, knowing exactly what that meant. No herds, no allies, no safety. A slow death carried out by hunger, exposure, or raiders who would not even bother to remember their names. Hoyalin refused to let that happen. She gathered wild onions from the ground. She fished in the river. She fed her children on food pastoral nomads considered shameful, things eaten only when all dignity had already been stripped away. But dignity did not keep children alive. She did. To Temujin, this was not just poverty, it was revelation. The tribal system he had been born into had not failed accidentally, it had rejected him deliberately. Bloodline offered no protection. Rank meant nothing without force to defend it. Then came the killing. As the boys grew older, Temujin's half-brother Bektar began to assert dominance. He withheld food. He reminded the younger children that he was older, stronger, and titled. In another family, this might have ended in submission. In this one, submission meant starvation. One day, Temujin and his brother Kasar took their bows. They ambushed Bektar. They shot him with arrows until he was dead. The act was brutal. It was also final. There was no ritual justification, no tribal sanction, just a calculation made by adolescents who had learned early that authority without legitimacy was a threat, not a protection. Temujin would never accept power simply because it claimed seniority. Power would have to prove itself or be destroyed. This was the environment that shaped him. Not a palace, not a court, but a landscape where survival required memory, decisiveness, and the willingness to cross lines others hesitated to approach. The steppe had tried to erase him. Instead, it trained him. And as Temujin grew, he carried these lessons with him about loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of weakness into the world still locked in chaos, still waiting for someone ruthless enough and patient enough to reshape it. When Temujin rose from the margins of the steppe, he did not do it alone. Survival had taught him suspicion, hunger had taught him patience, but ascent, real ascent, required something else entirely. It required alliances, and the first alliances he forged would define not only his rise, but the shape of his future cruelty. The first was an old debt, inherited rather than earned. Togrul, known to many as Ong Khan, ruled the Kariet Confederation from the heart of the steppe. He commanded warriors, controlled trade routes, and carried the prestige of a king. More importantly, he had once been blood brother to Temujin's father. In a world where memory was currency, that bond still mattered. Temujin arrived at Togrul's camp with a gift, a sable coat taken from his wife Berta's dowry. It was not a grand offering, but it was symbolic, a reminder, a request wrapped in respect. Togrul accepted. With that single gesture, Temujin stepped back into the political bloodstream of the steppe. The Keriet army now stood behind him. For the first time since his father's death, he was not exposed. The second alliance was older and far more dangerous. Jamyuka. They had sworn brotherhood as boys, not metaphorical friendship, but anda, blood brotherhood. They had slept under the same blanket, shared food, shared ambition. Jamyuka was everything Temujin was not: aristocratic, confident, descended from a respected lineage. Where Temujin had learned to endure, Jamyuka had been raised to rule. Together, they looked unstoppable. That illusion shattered the night the Merkits came. They raided Temujin's camp while he was away. They took his wife Berta and vanished into the north. The attack was not random. It was memory made violent, retaliation for a crime committed by Temujin's father decades earlier. For Temujin, this was more than loss. It was a test. He called on both alliances at once. Togrul brought the weight of the Keriets. Jamyuka brought speed, confidence, and prestige. Together, they struck the Merkits with overwhelming force. Camps burned, resistance collapsed. Berta was recovered. But she returned carrying a child. The boy would be named Jochi. The name meant guest. No one said the doubt aloud. No one needed to. Temujin accepted the child as his own. Publicly, the matter was closed. Privately, it never would be. That shadow would stretch far into the future, poisoning succession, splitting loyalties, and reminding Temujin that even victory left scars. As the years passed, the bond with Jamyuka began to strain. They no longer moved through the steppe the same way. Jamyuka gathered followers who believed leadership was inherited, bloodline mattered, pedigree mattered, authority flowed from ancestry. Temujin gathered a different kind of man: hunters, runaways, former slaves, warriors cast out by their clans, men who followed him not because of who his ancestors were, but because of how he rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. Promotion came through merit, discipline applied to all. This was not just a difference in leadership style, it was a direct challenge to the social order of the steppe. Jamyuka saw it clearly, and he despised it. The break came quietly, then all at once. Alliances shifted, friends chose sides, the steppe fractured again, this time along ideological lines. Jamyuka stood for the old world, Temujin for something untested, unsettling, and deeply threatening. Then Togrul turned, or rather, his court did. Manipulated by his son Sengum and alarmed by Temujin's growing independence, the Keriet leadership moved against the man they had once protected. In 1203, Temujin was defeated in battle and driven east, away from power, away from allies, away from safety. What followed should have ended his story. He retreated to the muddy shores of a remote lake. His army was gone, his reputation shattered. 19 followers remained. 19. They came from everywhere, different tribes, different faiths, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, animists, men with nothing left to lose. Together, they drank the filthy water of the lake and swore an oath. They would share the sweet and the bitter. No bloodline bound them, no clan, only shared defeat and a shared future. This moment would later be remembered as the Baljuna Covenant. It was not recorded in Mongol heroic tradition. Defeat rarely was, but it mattered more than any victory that came before it.
because from that oath emerged a new principle: loyalty to the leader above loyalty to the tribe. Temujin did not rebuild slowly. He rebuilt ruthlessly. He deceived the Karyots into scattering their forces, then destroyed them. He turned on the Tatars, his father's killers, and wiped them out entirely, ordering the execution of every male tall enough to stand above a wagon axle. It was vengeance, yes, but it was also policy, an announcement that resistance would no longer be absorbed, it would be erased. Then he faced the Naimans and Jamyka's coalition. At Chakirmaut, Temujin's reorganized army crushed them. Jamyka fled, hunted, betrayed by his own followers, who delivered him in chains, hoping for reward. They misjudged Temujin. He executed the traitors for betraying their lord. Then he turned to Jamyka and offered reconciliation, power, position, survival. Jamyka refused. He asked for an honorable death, no blood spilled, a clean end. He acknowledged what both men now understood. There was only room for one sun in the sky. Jamyka died. The old aristocracy died with him. By 1206, the steppe was unified under a single authority for generations. Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, ruler of all who lived in felt tents. But unification was not an ending. It was preparation. Beyond the steppe lay walls, cities, empires that had never faced an enemy like this one. And Genghis Khan was just getting started.
Power did not arrive for Temujin in a single moment of triumph. It arrived as a problem that needed solving. By 1206, the wars were over. The rival confederations had been broken, absorbed, or erased. The steppe, for the first time in living memory, answered to one authority. But conquest alone could not hold it together. The same forces that had once torn Temujin's childhood apart, tribal loyalty, blood feuds, personal ambition, were still alive beneath the surface. If left untouched, they would tear this new order apart just as easily. So Temujin did something no steppe ruler before him had done. He rebuilt society itself. At the headwaters of the Onon River, a great assembly was called. Chiefs, commanders, and elders gathered where the land itself carried ancestral weight. There, before men who had once hunted him, betrayed him, and fought him, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title mattered less than what followed. This was not a coronation. It was a declaration that the old world was finished. The new state was called the Great Mongol Nation, and it would not be held together by tradition, but by design. The first thing Genghis Khan dismantled was the tribe. For centuries, steppe society had been organized by lineage. Men fought alongside cousins, command followed blood, loyalty flowed upward through family lines, and when those lines broke, so did armies. Genghis Khan had lived through the consequences of that system. He had no intention of preserving it. He dissolved the tribes as political units and reorganized the entire population into a decimal structure. At the base were groups of 10 men. 10 became 100, 100 became 1,000, 10,000 formed a tumen. These were not symbolic divisions. They were how people lived, trained, fought, and survived. Men from rival clans were forced into the same unit. Enemies shared tents. Former raiders guarded one another's horses. Old identities were made irrelevant by proximity and necessity. Loyalty was no longer inherited. It was enforced, practiced, and rewarded. Command within this system followed a single rule: ability. Men rose because they performed. They fell because they failed. Lineage did not disappear, but it stopped being decisive.
What mattered was obedience to orders, competence under pressure, and loyalty to the Khan above all else. The result was something the steppe had never seen, a population that could be mobilized as a single organism. Orders traveled cleanly, units moved in coordination, desertion dropped because a man no longer fled alone, he fled with 9 others whose lives were bound to his. To protect this new order, Genghis Khan surrounded himself with something even more carefully constructed, the Imperial Guard. The Keshig was not just a bodyguard, it was an institution. Divided into day guards and night guards, it watched the Khan constantly, but its deeper purpose was control. The sons of powerful commanders were required to serve in its ranks. On the surface, this was an honor. In reality, it was leverage. Their presence ensured their father's loyalty. At the same time, it exposed the next generation of leaders to the Khan's discipline, his laws, and his way of thinking. The Keshig became a school, an academy of power. Many of the men who would later govern cities and command armies learned their craft there under constant surveillance. Force was no longer personal, it was institutional. Then came the law. The steppe had always lived by custom, enforced through revenge and reputation. Genghis Khan replaced that with the yasa, a body of rules that applied to everyone, including his own family. No single written copy survived. It may never have existed in one place, but its effects were unmistakable. Religion was removed from politics entirely. Priests, monks, shamans, and imams were exempted from taxes and military service, not because the Khan was devout, but because faith was useful. Protected religious leaders became allies instead of sources of rebellion. The crimes that had defined Genghis Khan's youth were outlawed: cattle raiding, wife kidnapping. Acts that once triggered endless feuds were now punished by the state. The cycle of revenge that had shaped the steppe for generations was interrupted by law. Even hunting was regulated. Seasons were enforced. Game was preserved. This was not environmentalism in the modern sense. It was control of resources on a continental scale. Above all else, the yasa demanded absolute obedience. Spies, deserters, sorcerers, anyone who threatened unity faced death, not as vengeance, but as deterrence. To administer this system, Genghis Khan entrusted authority to one man, Shigi Kutuku, his adopted brother. Judicial decisions were recorded, case by case, forming a body of precedent. Local commanders were no longer free to rule arbitrarily. Law followed the army. For the first time, justice moved with conquest. Finally, Genghis Khan addressed a weakness no nomadic empire had ever fully solved: administration. An empire that stretched across thousands of miles could not survive on memory alone. Orders needed to be recorded, taxes tracked, messages preserved. So he ordered the adoption of a writing system. The Mongol language would be written using the Uyghur script. The task fell to Tata Tonga, a captured administrator who understood bureaucracy better than any steppe warrior ever could. This decision changed everything. The Mongols began the slow transition from an oral culture to a literate one, not overnight, not cleanly, but permanently. The empire could now govern farmers, merchants, and cities without becoming them. By the end of 1206, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a coalition of tribes had become a machine, a society reorganized for war, a legal system built to prevent collapse, an administration designed to scale indefinitely. Genghis Khan had not just unified the steppe, he had engineered it. And now, with his rear secured and his people reshaped, he turned his attention outwards to a world of walls, wealth, and empires that still believed nomads could build nothing lasting. They were about to learn how wrong they were.
The Mongols did not conquer the world by accident. They did it while outnumbered. Again and again, Genghis Khan's armies faced enemies with larger populations, deeper resources, and fortified cities. What decided those wars was not mass, it was design. A war machine built for speed, endurance, and terror. At its core stood the mounted archer. Every Mongol warrior carried a composite bow made from horn, wood, and sinew, layered for strength and elasticity. It was small enough to fire from horseback, powerful enough to punch through armor at distance. This weapon turned movement itself into an advantage. The faster the rider, the deadlier the shot. Mobility was multiplied by horses. Each man maintained 3 or 4 mounts, rotating them throughout the day. While enemy armies marched, the Mongols flowed. They could travel distances that defenders believed impossible, appearing deep behind lines before warnings could spread. This speed was not reckless. It was sustained by logistics that cut dependency entirely. Mongol soldiers carried dried meat and curd. When food ran low, they bled their horses without killing them, drinking just enough to survive. There were no supply wagons to guard, no long lines to disrupt. The army fed itself as it moved, making it faster the farther it went. This freedom allowed Genghis Khan to choose when and where battles happened. Cities learned this too late. By the time defenders mobilized, the Mongols were already inside their territory. Training made this mobility lethal. In peacetime, the army practiced through the Great Hunt. Thousands of men spread across the land, forming an enormous moving ring that slowly tightened around prey. No animal escaped unless allowed. This was not sport, it was rehearsal. The same coordination governed the battlefield. Flanking maneuvers were executed with precision. Units moved as if sharing a single mind. And then there was the tactic that became legend, the feigned retreat. Mongol forces would appear to break and flee. Enemies, believing victory was near, abandoned formation to pursue. Discipline collapsed. That was the moment. The Mongols turned. Arrows fell from every direction. The pursuers became the surrounded. Few survived. This system rewarded talent without mercy. One of its greatest commanders was Jebe. He began as an enemy. In battle, he shot Genghis Khan, or his horse, depending on the account. Captured afterward, he did not deny it. He confessed openly. Instead of executing him, the Khan promoted him. Jebe went on to lead some of the deepest and most destructive raids in Mongol history, striking where no one expected and vanishing before resistance could form. Another was Subutai. He was not born to command. He was the son of a blacksmith. He entered the army as a teenager and rose through performance alone. Subutai became the empire's chief strategist, directing campaigns across continents, coordinating multiple armies hundreds of miles apart, using riders and signals. Under his direction, empires collapsed in sequence. What made the Mongol War Machine unstoppable was not brutality alone. It was coherence. Every part, weapon, horse, law, promotion, served the same purpose: to move faster than fear, to strike before understanding, and to ensure that once the Mongols appeared on the horizon, resistance came too late. By the first decade of the 13th century, the steppe was no longer the center of the story. It was the launch point. By unifying the Mongols and rebuilding their society for war, Genghis Khan turned outward. What followed between 1209 and 1225 was not a campaign in the traditional sense. It was a rolling, interconnected conflict that stretched from the borders of China to the heart of the Islamic world, a world war before the concept existed.
The first target was close and deliberate. To the southwest lay the Western Sea State, ruled by the Tangots. It controlled key trade corridors and sat directly on the Mongols' flank. Before challenging greater empires, Genghis Khan needed experience against walls. Early raids went well. Mongol cavalry dominated open ground, but when they reached fortified cities, momentum slowed. The nomads had mastered movement, not masonry.
In 1209, at the Shah capital of Yinchuan, the Mongols attempted something audacious. They tried to turn the Yellow River itself into a weapon, diverting its waters to flood the city. The plan failed catastrophically. The dikes broke. The flood drowned Mongol camps instead. But even failure could be weaponized. The threat alone convinced the Shah emperor to submit. Western Shah became a vassal state, paying tribute and providing troops. The lesson was clear. Siege warfare could be learned. Walls were not invincible. The real enemy lay to the east. For generations, the Jin dynasty had treated the steppe as a chessboard. They bribed tribes, engineered rivalries, and executed Mongol leaders when it suited them. One of those leaders was Ambagai Khan, an ancestor whose death remained a living grievance. In 1211, Genghis Khan declared war. The opening clash came at Yehuling, Badger's Mouth, a mountain pass where the Jin assembled their main field army. On paper, the Jin were superior in numbers. On the ground, they were immobile. The Mongols annihilated them. Maneuverability, discipline, and the coordination of generals like Mukhali shattered the Jin line. The road into northern China lay open. Then the war changed character. Cities resisted, walls rose. The Mongols adapted with frightening speed. Chinese engineers were conscripted. Siege weapons appeared in Mongol camps: catapults, trebuchets, gunpowder bombs. Knowledge moved faster than resistance. In 1215, Zhongdu, the Jin capital, modern Beijing, fell after prolonged siege and starvation. The city burned. Its wealth flowed north into Mongol hands. The Jin dynasty survived in name for years after, but its power was broken beyond repair. While China burned, another threat emerged far to the west. Kuchlug, a Naiman prince whose father Genghis Khan had defeated, seized control of the Kara Kitai Khanate in Central Asia. Once in power, he reversed decades of religious tolerance, persecuting the Muslim population. Genghis Khan did not go himself. He sent Jebei. With a relatively small force, Jebei did not conquer through slaughter. He announced freedom of worship. Mosques reopened. The population revolted. Kuchlug fled. He was hunted down and killed. The Kara Kitai lands were absorbed almost without battle. The Mongol frontier now touched the Islamic world. That contact would not remain peaceful. The collision came through diplomacy and arrogance. Genghis Khan initially sought trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, which ruled over much of modern Iran and Central Asia. A massive merchant caravan was sent to the border city of Otrar. The governor, Inalchuk, seized the goods and executed the merchants. Genghis Khan responded with restraint. He sent ambassadors demanding justice. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, made a decision that sealed his empire's fate. He executed the chief envoy and humiliated the others. On the steppe, killing an ambassador was not an insult. It was war without limit. In 1219, Genghis Khan mobilized an army estimated between 100 and 150,000 men. What followed remains one of the most complex strategic operations in military history. The army split. Jochi advanced from the north, drawing attention. Jebei and Subutai disappeared eastward, then south, executing a vast flanking maneuver.
Genghis Khan himself led the main force across the Kizil Kum Desert, terrain considered impassable for large armies. They emerged behind enemy lines. Bukhara fell first. The Darasan fled. Inside the Friday Mosque, Genghis Khan addressed the city. Chroniclers later put words in his mouth, words about divine punishment. Whether spoken or shaped by memory, the message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile. Samarkand followed. Its aqueducts were destroyed, its defenses dismantled. Otrar endured a 5-month siege before falling. Inalchuk was captured. His death became legend. Molten silver poured into his senses for punishment for greed. Whether true or not, the story spread faster than the army. Shah Muhammad II fled west. Jebe and Subutai pursued him relentlessly across mountains and deserts until he died alone on a Caspian island. Behind them, the main army moved through Khorasan. This was where terror became policy. Cities were given a choice: surrender and be taxed, resist and be erased. Merv surrendered. Its population was led out and slaughtered. Chroniclers wrote numbers that defy belief. Archaeology confirms the result even if the figures lie. Nishapur resisted. During the fighting, a Mongol prince was killed. His widow demanded vengeance. The city was annihilated. Accounts claim no living thing was spared. Head pyramids rose as warnings to the world. Herat followed. These were not spontaneous atrocities. They were signals. News traveled ahead of the Mongols faster than messengers. Cities opened their gates before the army arrived. While Genghis Khan consolidated Central Asia, Jebe and Subutai embarked on a final mission. They rode around the Caspian Sea, fighting Georgians, Cumans, and finally a coalition of Rus princes at the Kalka River in 1223. It was not a conquest, it was reconnaissance. They were mapping the future. By 1225, the known world had been violently reconnected. Trade routes shifted, populations collapsed, empires crumbled. From China to the Black Sea, no ruler could ignore the Mongols anymore. Genghis Khan returned east not as a conqueror resting, but as an architect surveying what still remained unconquered. And one enemy, thought already subdued, was about to make a final, fatal mistake.
The conquest did not end in silence. It ended in roads. From the ruins of cities and the collapse of empires emerged something no one expected, an age of stability created by violence, remembered by later historians as the Pax Mongolica. The term came centuries later, but the reality was immediate. For the first time, the Silk Road, from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean, operated under a single authority. What force had shattered, administration now bound together. Under Genghis Khan, merchants gained something rarer than profit: predictability. Banditry was punished without mercy. Local tolls were abolished or standardized. Caravan routes were patrolled. A proverb spread across Eurasia that a lone traveler carrying gold could cross the world unmolested. It was exaggeration, but it captured a truth. Trade had become safer than memory allowed. The spine of this system was the Yam. Across the empire, relay stations were established roughly a day's ride apart. Fresh horses waited, food and shelter were guaranteed. Imperial messengers moved with bells announcing their approach, changing mounts without stopping. Orders crossed continents in days. Information became a weapon more powerful than armies. Over time, the system opened to merchants. For a fee, traders gained access to the fastest communication network on Earth. Capital moved quickly, goods followed. Markets that had once been isolated became linked in real time.
Along those roads traveled more than silk. Gunpowder weapons moved westward from China. Siege techniques followed. Medical knowledge flowed both directions. Persian physicians brought surgical practices east. Chinese diagnostic methods traveled west. In China, an office for Muslim medicine institutionalized this exchange. The Persian astronomer Jamal al-Din was summoned to help reform calendars and build observatories. Star charts crossed languages. Time itself was standardized. Even taste changed. Crops spread. Textiles merged styles. Cloth of gold, nasij, circulated as both luxury and value. Culture stopped being local. Religion, too, moved differently under Mongol rule. Genghis Khan did not impose belief, he studied it. In 1222, feeling the weight of years, he summoned the Taoist sage Qiu Chu Chi from eastern China to his camp in the Hindu Kush. The journey alone took years. When the old man arrived, the Khan asked a simple question: how does one live forever? Qiu Chu Chi did not flatter him. He said there was no elixir, no potion, only ways to preserve life: discipline, restraint, moderation, and benevolent rule. The advice did not end the wars, but it impressed the conqueror. Qiu Chu Chi was granted protection and authority. Taoist institutions were exempted from taxes. In a time of violent transition, Chinese religious culture endured not through resistance, but patronage. This was the paradox of Mongol rule. The same empire that annihilated cities guaranteed the safety of roads. The same hand that destroyed cultures also preserved them and transmitted them. Violence created order. Order enabled exchange. Exchange reshaped the world. But stability was never the end goal. For Genghis Khan, peace was not a destination, it was an interval. And as the empire prospered, his founder was already moving toward the final chapter of his life, one last campaign, and a death that would be as guarded in secrecy as his rise had been in blood.
Genghis Khan did not die in triumph. He died at war. In 1227, after years reshaping the world beyond the steppe, he turned back toward home. The Western Shah, once subdued, once loyal, had rebelled. They refused to send troops. They misjudged what mercy meant to a man who treated obedience as law. The campaign was swift, punitive, relentless. And somewhere in that final march, the conqueror disappeared from history as abruptly as he had entered it. That Genghis Khan died during the Western Shah campaign is not disputed. How he died has never been settled. The earliest Mongol account, preserved in the secret history, offers no drama. It speaks of a fall from a horse during a hunt the year before, internal injuries, fever, a slow decline that accelerated at the end. Other stories followed. Centuries later, Marco Polo claimed the Khan was struck by an arrow in the knee during a siege. It is vivid, it is memorable, it is almost certainly second-hand. Modern medicine has added another possibility, a rapid 8-day collapse, symptoms described in later chronicles. An army moving through plague zones. Some researchers now suggest an infectious disease, possibly bubonic plague, ended his life. And then there are the legends, stories told by enemies, tales of humiliation, castration by a Tangut princess. These belong not to history, but to revenge dressed as myth. The truth remains hidden, deliberately so. Because even in death, Genghis Khan controlled the narrative. He ordered that his burial be secret. No monument, no marker, no shrine. The funeral procession moved in silence, killing anyone who crossed its path, at least according to later accounts. Whether exaggerated or not, the intention is clear. No one was to know where the body lay. Legend says horses were ridden over the grave to erase all trace, that a river was diverted to conceal it forever. These stories echo older royal burials across cultures. What endures is the taboo. The most likely resting place lies at Mount Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain where Temujin once prayed as a fugitive, where he hid from enemies long before the world knew his name. The region became the Ikhorig, the great taboo, forbidden ground, guarded for centuries by chosen clans. Even now, it remains untouched. Modern technology has scanned the landscape, drones, satellites, non-invasive surveys revealing shapes that might be human-made, but excavation is forbidden. The Mongolian state has chosen silence over certainty. The body of Genghis Khan has never been found. Perhaps more unsettling than how he died is how thoroughly he prepared for what came after. Unlike most steppe rulers, he planned his succession. There would be no immediate civil war, no scramble for legitimacy. He chose his third son, Ugadai, as Great Khan, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most diplomatic, the most balanced, the most likely to hold the system together. The empire itself was divided into patrimonies. Jochi's line would dominate the western steppe, later forming the Golden Horde. Chagatai took Central Asia. Tolui retained the Mongol homeland, and through him would come Kublai Khan, ruler of China. These divisions did not weaken the empire immediately. They allowed it to grow. For another century, Mongol Khanates would dominate Eurasia, shaping borders, economies, and cultures that still exist. Then there is the question of blood. In 2003, a genetic study stunned the world. A single Y chromosomal lineage appeared in nearly 8% of men across the former Mongol Empire, roughly 1 in 200 men alive today. The explanation seemed obvious. Genghis Khan and his male descendants had unparalleled reproductive access. For a time, the lineage was attributed directly to him. Later research complicated the story. Improved dating techniques suggested the lineage might predate Genghis Khan by centuries. It may belong not to one man, but to a broader ancestral population that rose with the Mongols. Without physical remains, uncertainty is impossible. What remains undeniable is scale. Through his sons, his generals, and the social structures he created, Genghis Khan reshaped humanity's genetic, political, and cultural landscape. Empires rose and fell after him. Roads crumbled, cities were rebuilt, his tomb vanished. But the systems he engineered, meritocracy, centralized law, religious tolerance, and global exchange, outlived the terror that created them. He began life abandoned on the steppe. He ended it having bound continents together. And long after his body disappeared into forbidden ground, the world continued to move along the paths he forced it to carve. The story of Genghis Khan does not resolve cleanly. It cannot. Measured one way, his legacy is written in ash. Cities erased, populations shattered, entire regions of Iran and China permanently altered in their demographic makeup. The number of dead is unknowable, 20 million, 40 million, perhaps more, but the scale is beyond dispute. He ruled through fear, and he understood fear as a tool of governance. Terror was not a byproduct of his wars, it was policy. Resistance was answered with annihilation, submission with survival. This was not cruelty born of chaos, it was calculated, deliberate, designed to move faster than armies, carried by rumor and memory, so that walls opened before siege engines arrived. But destruction alone does not explain what followed. Because in the space he cleared,
something unprecedented took shape. By breaking the tribal hierarchies of the steppe, Genghis Khan replaced lineage with performance. Men rose because they could act, decide, endure. Faith was separated from power. Commerce was protected. Ambassadors were made sacred. Law followed the army, restraining even generals from arbitrary rule. The result was an empire that did not merely conquer territory, it synchronized it. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road became a continuous system. Goods crossed continents, knowledge traveled with them. Gunpowder, medicine, astronomy, textiles, cuisine, ideas that had once moved slowly, now moved at the speed of horse relays. This was not globalization as benevolence, it was globalization enforced. Yet, it worked. For a century, Eurasia functioned as a connected world. Merchants planned routes that spanned thousands of miles. Scholars exchanged methods across cultures. States rose in reaction to Mongol systems, borrowing their administration, their census methods, their diplomacy. The Mongols did not stay, but the pathways they forced into existence remained. Even Mongol identity endured. A people once fractured into rival clans were given law, script, and political memory. That identity survived the empire's collapse. It persists today. The Persian historian Ala ad-Din Yuvaini summarized the Mongol arrival with brutal clarity. They came, they destroyed, they killed, they plundered, and they left. He was not wrong. But he did not live long enough to see what followed. Because in the vacuum left by Mongol conquest, the world reorganized itself around new connections. Trade expanded beyond previous limits. States learned to think in continental terms. The foundations of the modern global system, interlinked economies, rapid communication, cross-cultural exchange, did not begin in peace. They began in conquest. Genghis Khan was neither a misunderstood hero nor a simple monster. He was a force of compression. He collapsed distances. He accelerated history. He revealed how fragile civilizations were and how quickly they could be rewired. His legacy is not a verdict, it is a tension between annihilation and order, between terror and stability, between a man who destroyed worlds and a system that bound them together. And that tension, unresolved, is why his shadow still stretches across the modern age.